How successful has the Federal Reserve System been? It depends on your point of view. Since Woodrow Wilson took his oath of office, the national debt has risen from $1 billion to $455 billion. The total amount of interest paid since then to the international bankers holding the debt is staggering, with interest having become the third largest item in the federal budget. Interest on the national debt is now $22 billion every year and climbing steeply as inflation pushes up the interest rate on government bonds. Meanwhile, our gold is mortgaged to European central banks and our silver has all been sold. With economic catastrophe imminent, only a blind disciple of the accidental theory of history could believe that all of this has occurred by coincidence. When the Federal Reserve System was foisted on an unsuspecting American public, there was absolute guarantees that there would be no more boom and bust economic cycles. The men behind the scenes were pushing the central bank concept for the international bankers, faithfully promised that from then on there would be only steady growth and perpetual prosperity. However, Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. accurately proclaimed, "From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. Using a central bank to create alternate periods of inflation and deflation, and thus whipsawing the public for vast profits, has been worked out by the international bankers to an exact science." Having built the Federal Reserve as a tool to consolidate and control wealth, the international bankers were now ready to make a major killing. Between 1923 and 1929, the Federal Reserve inflated the money supply by 62%. Much of this new money was used to bid the stock market up to dizzying heights. At the same time that enormous amounts of credit money were being made available, the mass media began to ballyhoo tales of the instant riches to be made in the stock market. According to Ferdinand Lundberg, for profits to be made on those funds, the public had to be induced to speculate, and it was so induced by misleading newspaper accounts, many of them bought and paid for by the brokers that operated the pools. The House hearings on stabilizations of the purchasing power of the dollar disclosed evidence in 1928 that the Federal Reserve Board was working closely with the heads of European central banks. The committee warned that a major crash had been planned in 1927 at a secret luncheon of the Federal Reserve Board and heads of the European central banks. The committee warned the international bankers were tightening the noose. Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, came to Washington on February 6, 1929, to confer with Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury. On November 11, 1927, the Wall Street Journal described Mr. Norman as the currency dictator of Europe. Professor Carroll Quigley notes that Norman, a close confidant of J.P. Morgan, admitted, "I hold the hegemony of the world." Immediately after this mysterious visit, the Federal Reserve Board reversed its easy money policy and began raising the discount rate. The balloon, which had been inflated constantly for nearly 7 years, was about to be exploded. On October 24th, the feathers hit the fan. Writing in the United States Unresolved Monetary and Political Problems, William Bryan describes what happened. When everything was ready, the New York financiers started calling 24-hour broker call loans. This meant that stockbrokers and their customers had to dump their stock on the market in order to pay the loans. This naturally collapsed the stock market and brought a banking collapse all over the country because banks not owned by the oligarchy were heavily involved in broker call claims at this time. And bank runs soon exhausted their coin and currency and they had to close. The Federal Reserve System would not come to their aid, although they were instructed under the law to maintain an elastic currency. The investing public, including most stockbrokers and bankers, took a horrendous blow in the crash, but not the insiders. They were either out of the market or had sold short so that they made enormous profits as the Dow Jones plummeted. For those who knew the score, a comment by Paul Warburg had provided the warning to sell. That signal came on March 9, 1929, when financial Chronicle quoted Warburg as giving this sound advice. If orgies of unrestricted speculation are permitted to spread too far, the ultimate collapse is certain to bring about a general depression involving the whole countries. Sharpies were later able to buy back these stocks at a 90% discount from their former highs. To think the scientifically engineered crash of 29 was an accident or the result of stupidity defies all logic. The international bankers who promoted the inflationary policies and pushed the propaganda which pumped up the stock market represented too many generations of accumulated expertise to have blundered into the Great Depression. Congressman Lewis McFadden, chairman of the House of Banking and Currency Committee, commented, "If the Depression was not accidental, it was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so that they might emerge as rulers of us all. Although we have not had another depression of the magnitude of that which followed 1929, we have since suffered regular recessions. Each of these has followed a period in which the Federal Reserve tromped down hard on the money accelerator and then slammed on the brakes. Since 1929, the following recessions have been created by manipulation. 36 to 37, stock prices fell 50%. 1948, stock prices dropped 16%. 1953, stock declined 13%. 56, 57, the market dipped 13%. 57, late in the year, the market plunged 19%. 1960, the stock market was off 17%. 66, stock prices plummeted 25%. In 1970, the market plunged over 25%. Chart 5, based on one appearing in the highly respected financial publication Indicator Digest of June 1924-1969, shows the effects of the Dow Jones Industrial Average of the Federal Reserve policies of expanding or restricting the monetary supply. This is how the stock market is manipulated and how depressions or recessions are scientifically created. If you have inside knowledge as to which way the Federal Reserve policy is going to go, you can make a ton of money. The members of the Federal Reserve Board are appointed by the President for 14-year terms. Since these positions control the entire economy of the country, they are far more important than cabinet positions. But who has ever heard of any of them except possibly Chairman Arthur Burns? These appointments, which should be extensively debated by the Senate, are routinely approved. But here, as in Europe, these men are mere figureheads, put in their positions at the behest of international bankers who finance the presidential campaigns of both political parties. And Professor Quigley reveals that these international bankers who owned and controlled the banks of England and France maintained their power even after those banks were theoretically socialized. The American system is slightly different, but the net effect is the same. Ever-increasing debt requiring ever-increasing interest payments, inflation, and periodic scientifically created depressions and recessions. The end result, if the insiders have their way, will be the dream of Montague Norman of the Bank of England, that hegemony of world finance should reign supreme over everyone, everywhere, as one whole super-national control mechanism. Montague Norman by John Hargrave, Greystone Press, New York, 1942. So they did it in 1929. They loaned a bunch of fake money, and all of a sudden they said, you got to pay us back. So all the banks that they owned, they didn't call in, but all the private banks across the whole country, they did have to pay their debts off.
Yeah.
And so they all just went down. Lots of them lost all their money. It's complicated. It's hard for me to explain. It's hard to really understand. But it has happened before in 29. And that's when it was bad for this country. People were lined up for soup kitchens.
Yeah.
The bread lines. What they had. But yeah, that's it in a nutshell, how the Federal Reserve, which is just a private bank, which loans money to our government, which then our government does wherever it does the money. But it's just, come on, folks. Come on now. Can't let a private bank loan fake money to a government they own, and then tell us we gotta pay it back with real money. Okay, Chapter 4, Bankrolling the Bolshevik Revolution. We'll see how these international bankers have financed other countries' rises and falls of different governments.